The first email comes from Corey, who writes, "Hi, SGU, love the show. My only complaint is that it only comes out once a week. I was wondering what you all thought about the aquatic ape theory, the theory that humans in their past have an ancestor that spent time in the water as a way to explain our subcutaneous fat layer, our hairlessness, our ability to control our breathing, etc., all of which differentiate us from the apes. Is it pseudoscience? If not, why doesn't it have broader acceptance and or inquiry? Thanks."
We got 7,000 questions about that.
Yeah.
7,000.
Yeah, this
literally.
has been around for a long time, and then we've got this spurt of emails asking us about the aquatic ape theory. I think it's because the main proponent of it, Elaine Morgan, actually spoke at the TED conference recently. I think that's
what was she doing speaking there?
Yeah, I know, huh? I think that's what brought it back up to the surface. But this has been around for a long time. A really long time. So the notion that a human ancestor was somewhat adapted to an aquatic environment was first raised by Sir Alistair Hardy, who was a marine biologist in the, I guess, around the 1960s. And then it was mentioned by Desmond Morris in The Naked Ape in 1967. Had a couple of pages in the book, The Naked Ape. But then I don't think it really took off until a few of modern supporters really started to promote the idea. Most importantly, Elaine Morgan, who wrote The Descent of Women, and then also wrote The Aquatic Ape in 1982. And that's, I think, what really put it on the radar, is the book by that name, The Aquatic Ape. So this is just a really beautiful pseudoscience. It really is pure pseudoscience. It's a lot of fun, though, to dissect it. The thing that's really interesting about it is that a lot of people get hit out of left field with this. You know, they either read the book or an article about it or a lecture, and it's one of those situations where if you take a lot of information that seems to support one point of view, it could seem like a very compelling case, you know, especially if you don't know all of the nitty-gritty details or you don't really dig deep on each specific claim. So immediately, like, you invoke your pattern recognition, like, yeah, wow, there's all these things. It does seem to all add up and make sense that, you know, we're adapted to an aquatic environment. But when you start to scratch even just barely beneath the surface, it really all starts to fall apart. For example, one of the main lines of argument promoted by Morgan and other, you know, proponents of the aquatic ape theory is that humans are hairless, and that this adaptation is found only in aquatic mammals, among mammals, only in aquatic mammals and burrowing mammals. And since we're not a burrowing mammal, well, then we must be adapted to the water, right?
That kind of narrows it down. But
this is a massive exercise in cherry picking.
What about the aerial ape?
The aerial ape.
The fire ape.
For example, what about pigs? They don't have a lot of hair. Well, so then they get around those kind of counterexamples by playing footloose and fancy free with their definitions. Well, they say, well, pigs are wallowers. They wallow in mud, and that counts as aquatic. Huh?
Right. Yeah. So if you wallow, if you're a wallower, that's aquatic.
That's aquatic. Which always then, you know, leads to the question with this theory. Well, how aquatic is aquatic? And one of the fallacies that they commit is to just, you know, again, just change the definition of how aquatic is aquatic as needed to accommodate whatever they want.
Move the goalposts.
It's exactly as aquatic as it needs to be for any individual argument, but it doesn't have to all hang together and make sense, right? So that's
at one end of the spectrum, they wallow in mud, and the other one, they're at 6,000 feet.
Yeah. So there are counterexamples of mammals that are hairless that are not really aquatic. And also, out of about 31 groups of mammals that have adapted to a semi-aquatic or aquatic environment, only 3 are relatively hairless. The other 28 have hair, like beavers and otters, right? For example. So it's actually not a feature. The hairlessness is actually not a feature of aquatic adaptation. in fact, the only species that are aquatic, the only mammal species that are aquatic that are hairless are also very big. And in fact, there are lots of large terrestrial mammals that are also relatively hairless, like the elephant and the rhino and the hippo. It has more to do with heat regulation and body size than it does to being adapted to the water. Of course, then they make ridiculous statements that like rhinos spend a lot of time in the water, which is just absurd.
Or near the water.
Hippos do, but rhinos
looking at the water.
No. So they essentially sort of tweak the facts as needed, and sort of ignore the facts that are inconvenient. So if you look at hairlessness, it's really not an adaptation of aquaticness. It has to do with size and thermoregulation. And there's lots of different examples of hairless mammals that are not aquatic. Also, again, this is where you see the difference between looking for a superficial similarity and then using that as an argument for a hypothesis. The superficial similarity of like whales and people have relatively little hair, and not formulating an argument that hangs together when you really start to think about the details. For example, the mammals that are aquatic, that are hairless, not only are all large, but they are the most adapted to the water. Their evolutionary line has been adapting to an aquatic environment for tens of millions of years, whereas hominids have not been around for tens of millions of years. Right? So this is where they play with the definition of how aquatic is aquatic. We've been aquatic long enough to acquire whatever features they're saying are aquatic, but not long enough not to have any of the features that we're missing. So again, they could just arbitrarily decide how long that is. But in fact, if you try to make an actual comparison between species that are adapted to an aquatic environment, we don't fit them in any way. We don't have the same features.
And yeah, I mean, one of the things that interests me is that if we spent millions of years in the water, why did we suddenly develop really terrible ways to deal with being in the water, like a tendency to inhale when we go under the water, which obviously will lead to us dying. And
right.
We actually drown pretty easily for a species that supposedly spent millions of years in the water.
There's even such a thing as, I think they call it dry drowning, where you're basically, I think, panicking so much that your throat closes up and you just can't, no water, you drown, but no water actually even ever gets into your lungs because your throat just said, that's it, I'm done, I'm closing up, nothing's going in or out.
Yeah. The broader concept there is that there are features that are pretty ubiquitous among aquatic mammals, and we don't have those.
Yeah,
the ones that they say we have are not really aquatic features, and the ones that we would expect we would have, like not drowning, we don't have.